Good morning and welcome to the James Cowper Kreston Autumn Budget 2025 online seminar. So finally at 12:30 yesterday we had the certainty of what was actually in the budget rather than the endless speculation we've had over the last few months. Of course, whilst I'm saying 12:30, in reality, and a bit of a spoiler, as you all know, the details were released some 30 minutes earlier, apparently inadvertently by the OBR. I'm Sue Staunton, Managing Partner of James Cowper Kreston, and to explore the key announcements in the budget and their implications for businesses and individuals alike, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined this morning by three of my partners here in the studio. Darren O'Connor, Head of our Accounts and Advisory team, Sharon O'Markay, Head of our Private Client Tax team, and Business Tax Partner Alex Nicholson. We're also fortunate to be joined today by Paul Britton, the CEO of Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce, Paul Andrews of Family Business United, Becky Worth, Head of Government Affairs UK for 3M, and Luke Consiglio of the Pantry UK, to provide us with their impressions of what the Chancellor's 2025 statement means for them, and in the case of Paul, the two Pauls, for their members. Please do feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to address those at the end of the discussion. But initially, what I'd like to do is to ask our panel here in the studio for their headline impressions of the budget. Did it live up to expectations, Darren?
Well, it was certainly a feisty affair. The Deputy Speaker clearly had it all cut out for her in terms of how noisy it was in the studio, but she did a great job. I don't think the budget turned out to be quite as bad as people had feared. The scaremongering in advance and perhaps some of the leakages didn't always turn out to be true. So I think overall we'll find out the devil will be in the detail, but as it stands, perhaps not quite as bad as some had feared.
Sharon?
Yeah, I think at headline levels agreed that given the speculation and the endless noise that was issued beforehand, the outcome probably wasn't as bad as we feared. What I did notice that the Chancellor actually said was that she was building on last year's changes to capital gains tax, inheritance tax, VAT on school fees and the non-dom changes. And that this budget was going to sustainably raise further revenue from sources of wealth. So I think that sets the overall tone. What we have seen is obviously at headline level a freeze in the personal tax thresholds, personal allowances, national insurance thresholds for the next 3 years. So income tax personal allowance is frozen, the higher rate threshold is frozen, and the additional rate threshold is frozen at 125,000, remembering that came down already from 150,000 a couple of years ago. Those were all frozen until 2031. Same with the national insurance secondary threshold is also frozen. Of more interest was that actually, given the fact that we had an intention not to break the manifesto on the key rates of tax, we have seen announcements on investment income. So from April 2026, we've got changes to dividend tax. From April 2027, saying changes to savings tax and a new property income tax that's been brought in. So all of those are going to rise by 2%. What that means is a basic rate on dividends is going to go to 10.75% and the higher rate to 35.75%. No change to the top rate of dividend tax at 39.35%. So not only does that affect savers, it also massively penalises those smaller owner-managed businesses, which on top of last year's national insurance rate is going to hurt. The basic higher and additional rates on savings and property income are going to rise to 22%, 42%, 47%. For property, there's a slight silver lining in that the interest relief that you can get for mortgage interest on property income also goes to 22%. But a lot of quiet tax rises actually that we will see coming through in the coming years.
Thank you. Alex?
Well, if I could just pick up briefly on the 2% increase in income tax on dividends for higher and basic rate taxpayers. Obviously, for company owners, this raises the obvious point about whether there would be benefit in taking a dividend before April 26, where cash flow allows. I think it will also potentially change the wider remuneration planning piece for owner-managed businesses or owner-managed companies, and whether to take dividends or salary. In many cases, salary will be slightly more tax efficient than dividends, but it very much depends on the specific circumstances. So more widely though, my initial impression of the budget really was that most of the potentially very significant tax measures, which have been discussed in the media over recent weeks, for example, limiting tax-free cash on pensions and the cap on lifetime gifting, well, they've not come to pass. And what this means is that the financial and tax landscape remains broadly unchanged, at least for now, and that there are still a range of legitimate measures that individuals and business owners can and should take to arrange their affairs efficiently.
Okay, thank you. Well, throughout today's seminar, we're going to be running also a series of polls for you to take part in, and these are going to come up on the right-hand side of your screen. The first is, do you, the audience, believe that the autumn budget provides enough certainty for long-term business planning? And I see people are voting already, so I'll leave you to place your votes whilst we carry on with our presentation. Sharon, over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of talk around income tax and fiscal drag. What's your take on what Rachel Reeves finally announced in relation to that?
Yeah, so as I've covered, we've got freezes on the main income tax rates, thresholds, national insurance thresholds until April 2031. Remembering also that things like the inheritance tax nil rate band has been frozen since 2009 at £325,000. So when wages increase with inflation or you get pay rises, essentially more people are going to be pulled into paying tax for the first time or into the higher rate tax bands, which increases essentially the number of basic, high rate and additional rate taxpayers each year. And that it raises the effective tax on the population as a whole. So you'll pay more tax over time, even if your real inflation-linked income doesn't actually increase. So additionally, when we're looking at freezing those thresholds, we've also got to think about the impact on things like child benefit, which obviously will also be tapered for some people. So by 2031, we've got more than 5 million people are going to be paying income tax. Nearly 5 million people will be paying the higher rate of income tax, and over 500,000 people will be paying the additional rate of income tax. So what we're seeing is a population as a whole, the highest rates of tax, we're going from 15% of the population to 24% of the population are now going to be in that 40 and 45% tax rate. That's effectively, the forecasts are that the changes that are brought in now and the incremental changes is going to yield about £67 billion in due course. So what we're seeing is that fiscal drag is, although we might not have seen any changes to the top rates of tax, it's a little bit sneaky because actually over the next sort of 5 years or so, there will be a significant tax take.
So that's quite interesting, Sharon. So with that in mind then, Darren, do you think that this budget is going to calm the markets in the longer term? And do we think that Rachel Reeves is going to avoid the Liz Truss moment?
Yeah, well, early signs say we've avoided the Liz Truss moment, although at 12 o'clock when the documents were released in error, that the markets did take a bit of a shock. We saw that recover, and by the end of the day, I think was in a reasonable position. We'll see what happens today, but that's certainly the view that the media and the markets are showing so far. So I think it was a budget to try and calm the markets, and for Rachel Reeves to make clear that she is very serious, along with the government, in terms of keeping to their fiscal rules that they set out earlier on in their manifesto. But I don't think we can hide away from the fact that as a country, every £1 of our £10 we spend goes to interest covering our national debt, and that's paying the interest, not paying down on the debt. So it is pretty clear that over a period of time we do need to find a way to grow at a greater rate than 1.5%. So hopefully there are some productivity, supply side measures in the budget, such as the apprenticeships and so on, that can help us all grow for the benefit of the country. Picking up on business confidence and similar to what was in the survey or the question, I'm not convinced the budget has necessarily helped business confidence. You know, we've gone through a period and the 8 weeks leading up to it of the leakages clearly have not helped, where businesses are not really clear on what the government strategy is and what their plans are for the future. And I think that is in fact impacting investment decisions, the appetite to take risk and so on. So hopefully we can see a more long-term clear vision in the coming weeks and months.
Thanks, Darren. I think that's now a good point to come back to our poll question and the result of the poll. Very interestingly, do we believe the autumn budget provides enough certainty for long-term business planning? Very small percentage, 15% of people feels that it did give some clarity. 51% felt that it adds uncertainty, and at this stage we have 34% of the respondents who are unsure. And I think the unsure is probably understandable because there's a lot of detail still yet to come out that sits behind the Chancellor's statement in the Commons yesterday. Okay. So, Alex, when Rachel Reeves talked about, and this is one of the things you're coming back to Darren's point about business growth, and is there something in there for business? Rachel talked about start-up, scale-up and stay in relation to businesses within the UK. And she very much continued that government's narrative since the beginning of their term of the future of the economy being dependent on business, and particularly upon those within the technology and innovation space. To what extent do you think that the budget really did support that objective?
Well, I think there were certainly a number of sort of smaller targeted areas of support that were announced. I think one of the examples that I picked up on was a new Innovate UK grant. I think it was called a Growth Catalyst Programme that was going to be worth 130 million and as I said, which will offer grants to, I think it said frontier companies. I'm not quite sure what that means. So that's an example of a small targeted measure. However, for the mainstream, I think really there were few significant measures to support startups and scaling. But nevertheless, there were a couple of welcome changes that we did pick up on and which I thought we could perhaps cover now. So one such measure for scale-up businesses was the announcement that the size of companies which are able to raise investment under the tax-advantaged enterprise investment scheme and also for venture capital trusts is going to be doubled from April 26. So what that means is that qualifying companies will now be able to raise up to £10 million annually, and that's increased from 5 million. And that actually the overall lifetime limit that these companies can raise is going up to 24 million. It was previously 12 million. So these schemes are very much a successful lifeline for some companies where they need to raise finance to expand. So certainly these measures will enhance them further. However, there was a sting in the tail for VCTs, not EIS, because it was announced that the rate of income tax relief that will attach to qualifying investments into VCTs is going to decrease. It's currently 30%, and that's going to go down to 20% from next April. For EIS investments, this is still being maintained. So bearing in mind that EIS and VCT investments are into high-risk businesses, there's been quite a lot in the press already actually about VCTs expressing concern that this is going to lead to a reduction in funding support that they're able to provide to early-stage companies. So a good piece and a not-so-good piece there in relation to those businesses. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And you indicate there were a couple of measures that you'd picked up on. What was the other one?
Well, the second welcome measure that I was going to pick up on covers enterprise management incentive share option schemes. Enterprise management incentives, or EMIs, as they're more commonly known, are tax-advantaged share options that many of our SME clients use extremely successfully to attract and retain key individuals within their business. So to expand on the tax advantage, I guess, broadly, EMI share options, they allow the option holders to benefit from the growth in value of their employer, i.e. the company that they've helped to build. And this works by taxing any gains they realise when they eventually come to sell their shares to capital gains tax rather than income tax, where the rate will typically be lower. I think it's also the case that in the vast majority of cases, EMI option holders will also qualify for business asset disposal relief. So actually the CGT rate is moved below the headline rate of 24%. So on gains of up to 1 million, it's currently 14%, albeit that it was previously announced that that's going to go up to 18% next year. So similar really to the doubling in the company size limits for EIS and VCT, it was announced that the size of companies that can grant EMI qualifying share options will be increased significantly from April 26. In particular, there's going to be a doubling of the employee limit, which means that companies with up to 500 employees, it was previously 250, will be able to grant EMI qualifying options. And this is very much a positive because actually a 500 employee company is typically quite a large company. And we've certainly seen the 250 employee limit be a barrier to some of our clients in being able to grant tax advantaged EMI qualifying options. One threshold that doesn't appear to have changed, though, in relation to EMI is the individual limit of 250,000 on the value of EMI qualifying options that an individual can hold. It sounds quite generous, 250,000, but actually it's been in place unchanged since 2012, I think. And in practice, it can be a barrier to being able to provide a worthwhile number of sort of share options in some cases, maybe not for very sort of small early stage companies, but where you've got those that are a little bit more established, that £250,000 limit isn't huge, and it would have been nice to have seen that doubled as well.
Yeah, thank you. So Sharon, Alex has talked about the measures within the budget aimed at getting more investment into UK businesses, but do you think they're sufficiently attractive to private investors? Because there are a few little bits in what he was talking about that made it seem that maybe not so attractive, but we welcome your thoughts.
Yeah. So whilst we welcome the ongoing stability with VCTs and EIS regimes, and obviously an increase in what can be raised at business level, for individual investors, the budget really doesn't do anything to actively retain or incentivise further investment. So I think the direction of travel is towards higher effective tax on investment income, reduces the after-tax returns, and there are no new personal tax incentives to offset that. So I think the lack of new enhanced schemes for angel investors, start-up backers or retail shareholders means that the UK's appeal to individual investments is pretty average, I think, compared to other countries. I think the other thing to mention is that we've also got the additional limitation to business property relief for inheritance tax, which a lot of wealthy individuals may well have put money in through EIS, for example. So essentially, the risk and reward of those investments is actually less attractive than it has been in the past. So I think that whilst the UK remains a strong jurisdiction for investors, it's less competitive for personal tax efficiency compared to some international alternatives.
So do you think that means that tax policies are driving high net worth individuals to leave the UK? I mean, we've all seen some headlines and so on, but it would be really helpful to get your take on what you're seeing.
So I think, as you say, the OBR and the Home Office have both noted that net immigration figures are now below forecast, and mainly in part because of the emigration from the UK is much higher than previously thought. That includes a range of people, and there's anecdotal and professional evidence that high net worth individuals, and not just those who were non-domiciled, this includes Brits, are among those choosing to actually relocate outside of the UK to tax-friendly jurisdictions. And there's also a lot of those tax-friendly jurisdictions are making significant overtures to the British population at the moment.
Yeah.
So the combination, I think, of less favourable tax policies, seeking to drive revenues from sources of wealth, the removal of long-standing reliefs and the uncertainty is contributing to an environment where wealthy individuals are considering or have already chosen to leave the UK. And that's reflected in the official migration statistics, with higher than expected emigration due to lower net migration figures as well. So what that ultimately means is that wealth is draining away from the UK.
Okay, so that's concerning if it's draining away.
Yeah.
What about looking at the other side of it? Do we think that this budget is going to help to attract inward investment?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting time, because whilst we're seeing a flow of individuals leaving the UK, we're also seeing people coming into the UK and wanting to relocate here from other jurisdictions. And in particular, we're seeing a trend with Americans coming into the UK and choosing to relocate for various reasons. We have seen a tightening up of the non-dom regime, but there are still opportunities for individuals to come to the UK and benefit from 4 years' worth of foreign income and gains not being taxed in the UK, even if they bring that into the UK. And if you're in a jurisdiction that doesn't tax citizens, then you can actually get some very, very attractive global tax rates. So short term, that may work. The sting in the tail on that is that actually once you've been in the UK for 10 years and being UK resident, your global assets are going to be subject to inheritance tax in the UK. And that inheritance tax, with a frozen nil rate band at 325,000 and a headline rate of 40% and less attractive reliefs available to them, is actually going to disincentivise people wanting to stay in the UK over the long term. So we've got a regime that works short term for people coming to the UK. Actually, my experience is that people are saying, well, unless you can fix that inheritance tax problem, we will be gone before year 10. So the government's seeking views on how to develop its offering for high talent new arrivals. So we may see improvements in the immigration and tax landscapes for inward talent. But one of the things we're keeping a close eye on is that actually the decisions we make for tax reporting may well have an impact on immigration status. So we have to actually dovetail those more closely than we may have done in the past. Also, a welcome relief is that we didn't see any exit taxes for those leaving the UK, nor have we seen a wealth tax other than the proposed mansion tax, which I'll cover later. But we have seen some sort of, small areas of tightening up of non-residence rules for those who leave the UK with trading profits to effectively stop you sort of crystallising those after you've left. So a bit of a mixed bag, really.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Sharon. I mean, thinking about this whole piece about inward investments and so on, I think it makes a really good time to bring in Becky from 3M and Paul from the Chamber of Commerce. Hi, Becky. Hi, Paul. Becky, 3M are a global brand. Do you think this budget really does incentivise overseas investment into the UK? And what else do you think could have been done to help further?
Thank you for the opportunity to be part of the event this morning. I initially thought you were very brave deciding to hold this webinar the first thing in the morning, the day after the budget. You've beat the CBI, who aren't doing any events until tomorrow for their members, so it's very impressive. Quality of the analysis has been superb so far, so thank you for that. 3M, as you know, is a US headquartered company, but we do have a significant presence in the UK. 3 plants manufacturing PPE and also industrial tape, plus our HQ in Bracknell in the Thames Valley. And we're famous for Post-it notes, but we supply over 27,000 different products to customers all over the world, including industries like energy, aerospace, automotive, and digital. So while the government initiatives we've seen this year, like the industrial strategy, were good, we've been waiting for the budget to see if there was anything to incentivise future investment by global companies like ours. And to be honest, while there were some helpful measures, we didn't see anything headline grabbing. But I think, to be honest, we weren't really expecting anything headline grabbing. Ultimately, aside from lots of great initiatives in things like the industrial strategy, companies like mine need a skilled workforce at the right price, proximity to our markets, and then a taxation and incentive system that supports what we do. And the national insurance contributions increase in last year's budget moved one of those metrics in the wrong direction. And we didn't see any game changers in those big areas yesterday for us.
Okay, thanks, Becky. Paul, as CEO of Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce, you're talking to businesses that are looking to come into the UK for the first time. And what are the key factors that you're finding these businesses are typically looking for? And do you think that these have been addressed in the budget?
Good morning and thanks. As you'll all be aware, the Thames Valley's performed well in terms of attracting inward investment over the years. I want to go back to where we started in terms of the session about the leaks around the budget. I think if you look at this through the lens of a North American company, considering where they set up, and it's increasingly competitive as to where foreign-owned companies set up their subsidiaries, that really didn't help. It didn't reflect that we're a well-organised, stable, investment proposition. So we heard the Deputy Speaker pick that up, and I think that really does need to be addressed. And in terms of the technical, I agree with Becky, actually, that there wasn't really standout policies, changes in tax incentives that are going to encourage that innovation, encourage that in investment. And I can remember when the likes of patent box and other R&D tax credits were introduced. That was a real standout. That really did change the narrative and encourage inquiries. I didn't see that yesterday.
Okay, thank you. And Becky, what are the challenges that you have through operating in the UK, and has the budget actually helped to overcome any of those challenges?
I'd echo what Paul said about the endless kite flying and leaks by the Treasury in the media over the past 6 to 8 weeks. Andy Haldane, who's ex-Bank of England, stated that he believes the uncertainty in itself has caused weaker than expected economic growth in the last quarter. And that was before we even got to the budget. And my colleagues in the leadership team in Minnesota, who make investment decisions on a global basis, will have been reading the UK media, the Financial Times and all of the other papers. So they will have seen that. And more broadly, as I said earlier, we supply to almost every industry sector. So our customers' success is our success. And when they have challenges, we're impacted too. So we welcome the additional investment in AI, the extension to the electric car grant, investment in EV charging infrastructure, the pathways for investment in the nuclear sector, the North Sea Future Plan, which is going to relax restrictions on new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. They were all good, but measures that we've seen, like the electric vehicle excise duty, will be unhelpful for some of our customers and therefore unhelpful for 3M.
Yeah, I can see that. Paul, what do you think for your members will be one of the most significant of the announcements that Rachel Reeves made yesterday?
Training, workforce development, that's always eye-catching for members. We know the challenges and cost pressures weren't helped with the A&I increases. So the headlines are good. This headline scrapping of the co-investment payments for smaller businesses around apprenticeships and investing in younger colleagues, under 25. That sounds really positive, but I heard the expression devil in the detail a little earlier on. Of course, we've got to weigh that up with the expected national living wage and minimum living wage increases as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see how our members respond to that over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both very much for the moment. We'll be coming back to you shortly. But what I'd like to do is just sort of change focus a little bit. Sharon, can I come to you? You mentioned mansion tax earlier. And I know that's been subject of much speculation. Certainly a lot of the press have been very much focusing on the damage that this might, their perception of the damage this might potentially do to the elderly, homeowners and so on and so forth. What actually was announced yesterday in relation to this?
Yeah, we've got a natty new title to grapple with. So it's the high value council tax on residential property, which I think most people are calling the mansion tax. It's only for property in England, and it's due to come into play in April 2028. The valuations are going to be based on 2026 valuations, and those valuations are going to be revalued every 5 years. I'm not entirely sure how this is actually operationally going to work in terms of being able to get valuations done in 2026, but we will see. It's a charge on homeowners, not occupiers, and it is subject to wider consultation. So what we've got is the headline on it, but I think there's probably a lot more detail that needs to be flushed out in terms of the operation of it. Who's going to be collecting, obviously councils, the council funding for that, where the exemptions might apply. And I guess, for me, it's if you have multiple properties and those multiple properties are below, say, the starting point actually, are those going to be amalgamated? How is the system actually going to be structured? So a lot of uncertainty on that. What was announced is that it starts at properties over £2 million, so 4 bands, properties between £2 and £2.5 million, £2,500 a year is going to be collected. At the upper end, properties over £5 million in value are going to be paying £7,500 a year, so quite punitive. It is forecast to raise just over £400 million by 2029, which does seem to be a very small amount, but actually probably politically popular, and follows this theme of seeming to take money from the wealthy to redistribute to those who are in more need. I think that this actually is signalling potentially the start of a wider property review. The fact that it's subject to consultation, that it's being moved back to April 2028. I wonder whether actually it's going to be part of a wider reform of council tax to SDLT. And I noticed somebody had asked a question in terms of the wider council tax bands. I think there is something in the detail around looking at increasing council tax for the higher rate bands, but I think that we're lacking a lot of detail on that at the moment.
I think I share your view there, Sharon, that it does feel that this is the thin end of the wedge, and you do wonder if this is the start of a full review of council tax. Most governments have steered clear in the past, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over time.
Thanks, Darren. I mean, interestingly, we heard that the Chancellor is planning on giving listed companies some tax breaks. But what about SMEs?
Yeah, so the breaks for listed companies, UK companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, and the main tax relief is a 3-year exemption from stamp duty. There's nothing in there for smaller markets, perhaps AIM or other, which is interesting in itself. We looked at some of the stats yesterday, and only 3 companies so far in 2025 have listed on the London Stock Exchange and 6 on AIM. If you compare that to 2021, there was over 126 companies, so clearly a big disparity. So you can understand why the government have looked to incentivise in that area. But to answer your question on SMEs, there wasn't too many tax giveaways, in all honesty, which is a real shame given it's the lifeblood, and most people would agree it's the lifeblood of our economy. I think 90% of registered businesses sit within the category of SMEs, employs over 60% of our workforce, and accounts for over half of our private sector revenue. So it does feel like it's a big and important part of our sector that sometimes, or perhaps at the moment, is being missed. So slightly disappointing.
I mean, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think the listing thing, it's a big headline, and it sort of shows, is the UK at that level open for business? And certainly we've seen a number of clients, particularly in the technology field, just bypassing the London markets altogether and going straight into the US and NASDAQ and so on. So it'd be very interesting to see if this does actually do enough to change that. Alex?
Well, I was just really going to add that I agree with Darren that it would have been positive to see some more headline measures really aimed at supporting SMEs. I mean, obviously, we have already talked about the EMI share options, and I think that is a genuine positive. I mean, certainly during her speech, the Chancellor made some sort of play around changes to capital allowances and a sort of 40% first-year allowance, which sort of on the face of it sounded as though it might be something positive. But actually, when we've looked into the details of it, I think really our view is that it's going to have minimal, if not no, impact for the majority of SME businesses, because actually they're already able to benefit from 100% capital allowances in their first year on their most of their fixed asset purchases, and in fact actually it's also being coupled with a reduction in the rate of writing down allowances. So actually, when you look at the detail of it, overall these combined measures are expected to raise, I think, 1.5 billion annually for the Treasury in a few years' time. Probably not an issue for our SME businesses there, as I've said, but actually I think that burden is probably going to fall on certain larger businesses. So it's actually quite a significant tax increase there through slowing down the rate of tax relief that companies will get.
May not impact SMEs immediately, but may well sort of affect them later on. So, Sharon, would you like to pick up on the announcement about salary sacrifice for pensions and how that's going to affect individuals and their employers?
Yeah, so as forecasted, we have seen some changes to employee pension contributions through salary sacrifice. These measures are not due to come in until April 2029, but essentially anyone who's got salary sacrifice pension contributions over £2,000 per year after April 2029, there'll be additional liability to employer and employee NIC contributions. What's interesting is that actually that is forecast to raise £4.7 billion in 2029-2030. So it's quite a significant sum of money. So currently salary sacrifice arrangements can enable both the employee and employers to save national insurance on the amount contributed to pensions. And there's still a window of opportunity to be able to do those contributions before April 2029. So, at least we've got some opportunity for people to take advantage of that. But ultimately it reduces the national insurance and tax benefits of making a larger salary sacrifice pension contribution, which particularly affects the higher earners and owner managers. And effectively this is just another disguised NIC hike on business. I think my understanding is it was really aimed, I think, at the bankers' bonuses, but I'm not entirely sure that was a reality, and what's really going to be the reality is the impact on SMEs and owner-managed businesses who've tried to provide additional support to their staff by sharing that NIC saving. On a positive note, we haven't seen any other wider changes to pension, so nothing changing higher rate relief, and as Alex said earlier, no real changes to the annual and lifetime allowances or the tax-free lump sum. So that is a positive as well.
Yeah. You do wonder if the 4.7 billion is based on current behaviours, and employers and employees will change their behaviours. So whether it will raise that sort of revenue, who knows? But
it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because actually, all this does is further disincentivise the saving into pensions, and broaden the gap between public sector and private sector pensions, which obviously is quite a significant unfairness in our current system.
You mentioned the word stealth tax. You do wonder if the government clearly has some manifesto pledges that they're trying to stick to. Whether they have or they haven't, I don't know. But it does feel that tax is getting more and more complicated as a way to get around that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Having talked about the importance of SMEs to the economy, now would be a really good point to bring in Luke from the Pantry and Paul from Family Business United for their thoughts. Thank you both very much for joining us today. Luke, you've got a large workforce, and following on from the impact last year of the rise in employers' national insurance, and this year then the announcement of the increase in the national minimum wage and the living wage, what do you think the impact of this budget is going to be for your business?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me on. As you mentioned, I'm a contract catering owner, so we have a large workforce, and generally, mainly we feed kids in schools. So just mention that because not only are we in contract catering where margins are tight, they're extremely tight when it comes to feeding children. The minimum wage increase, I think, is fair in principle. I want a workforce who is paid well, who can live better lives, but also as a business, you need to be able to afford that and these pay increases. And with constant sort of NI increases, you said minimum wage increases year on year, that is becoming tighter and tighter and really creating a situation where we've got to make decisions on how hard we can push in terms of growth and how the people we can employ. And it's also a bigger piece of work here because this isn't just an increase for sort of minimum wage employees. Working in contract catering, that means that the gap between them, maybe kitchen assistants and their chefs, becomes even tighter. So this is a pay increase in our industry for everybody. We can't just miss out those people who are taking extra responsibility within kitchens. So it's a tough pill to swallow when it is just consistent at the moment. And then also, I guess, the sort of the skies tax, which is freezing the threshold because people's mortgages stay the same, people's rent stays the same, their outgoing stays the same. And when they're seeing less in their pay packet, the people they come to bridge that gap is their employers. So there's a much bigger piece of work there for us that we're going to be doing, see how this actually affects us over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. And Luke, would you be passing those costs on effectively to your customers? Because presumably that's the only place you've got to go when you've got thin margins.
Well, in principle, that would be the solution. But the issue we have, obviously, on the other side of this is there's inflation, food inflation, which has been at record highs over the previous year. So we've got to a stage now in contract catering where the only place that you're left to go is either pass it back to the client, where you then become, it's an industry that becomes less competitive, or maybe just, reducing the quality of food because that's the only place left to go is on the plate. So it's a bit more complicated than it once was about just increase the cost to your clients because they're also tight for money.
And there is a circular thing there as well, isn't there? Because if you're doing catering for schools, most of those are within the state sector, and therefore then that fuels the overall cost to government.
Absolutely.
So it all becomes a bit very, very, very circular.
Absolutely, and some of the bits that we've been working on, and especially myself, is increasing the sort of the funding that we get to feed children. I don't think anyone can argue that would be a real great use of the government's money. But as that hasn't increased for many, many years, but food increases have been, like I say, record, and labour now continues to increase. The only place that we as a business are having to look is now potentially on the plates of children. And do we really want to live in a country where we're talking about feeding children less healthy food?
Yeah. Thank you, Luke. Thank you. That's really, really interesting. I think at this stage it would be useful for us to have another poll. So what will be coming up on your screens now is, for those sitting online, is do you believe that the autumn budget is going to make it easier for your business to hire and to retain staff? So please place your votes now. So just Paul, as CEO of Family Business United, your members will typically be impacted in relation to both personal and business tax. What's your take on the impact of the budget on your members, and what are they already beginning to say to you?
It's a really good question. So I think they're still reeling from the last budget in terms of all the national insurance cost increases and also the changes to APR and BPR that caused a lot of concerns. The general consensus is there wasn't a lot in yesterday that changed much. The increased costs of doing business are significant. I think the bigger impact for me, and talking to family business around the country, when we're talking about family business, there are 5 million family firms in Britain. They employ 12 million people and they generate about 2.8 trillion in revenue. You talked earlier about the startup scale-up opportunities and some of the tax reliefs being posed for startup technology businesses. Family firms think in generations. They've been around for generations, and there wasn't much in it for them. They need certainty. They need a growth agenda. They need policies that support them to invest in their businesses like they have done for many years. And there wasn't much around that we saw yesterday. I think there's also the balance in terms of mental health and well-being. Business owners like Luke have been running their business successfully for many years, but the last 3 months of constant changes, backtracking, forward thinking, this might happen, it's just added to the health and well-being stress and mental capacity that owners have to deal with running in businesses that are the lifeblood of the economy. So I think for me, I think the process we've been through in the last couple of months has been shambolic. Has there been much good news for the family business sector? Probably not, no.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Luke, what's your takeaway? I mean, following on from what Paul's talked about, what's your takeaway about the direction of travel of this government as regards supporting family businesses?
Well, it seems to me not just family businesses as a whole, really. I believed and I hoped that when this government came in that there'll be a real investment in sort of supporting businesses to grow. I think we all can agree that that is the way out of this this black hole. I don't think you can do that through raising taxes. And for us personally, even we could be twice the size of the business we are. We're a really high demand business. We do a really fantastic job. But we are now talking centrally about growth much more steady rate than it could be because there's just uncertainty. You don't know what's coming up in the next budget. As Paul just mentioned, you don't know what's going to be leaked constantly. There's no stability. There's sort of no trust there anymore. So, but like I say, for us even, we are now talking about changing our next couple of years in terms of growth because we just don't know what's around the corner.
And that, of course, thank you for that view. But I mean, that's really interesting because, of course, that goes directly contrary to what Rachel Reeves was saying yesterday was the intention of the budget from a business perspective when she came out with the rhetoric about start up, scale up and stay. Thank you for that contribution. Paul, working with family businesses as you do, was there anything in the budget that you think might help with succession planning? Because, of course, you know, these are multi-generational businesses that you work with.
Yeah, you have to give some credit, I guess, to the concession in terms of the APR BPR change and the 1 million threshold now being able to be transferred to partners and spouses. But that's quite a small number in terms of these businesses that have been around for generations that could have huge potential IHT liabilities down the line. I think the one thing the last budget probably did and expedited was the conversations around succession, because obviously until the changes, it was easy to pass the shares on tax-free without any inheritance tax, whereas that changed. So we've seen much more conversation and plans being put in place to mitigate risks going forward. I think that will continue. I think also, I think Paul alluded to earlier, the changes with regards to the dividends tax means that the whole financial remuneration and how you pay salary versus dividend needs to be reviewed. I think there are some positives in terms of conversations, but they're conversations that are out of necessity now that would have happened at some point, but they're being forced forward. Families just need more certainty, so they just need policies that encourage them to invest in their business, invest in their staff, invest in their technology. We've got members that have actually since last year have cut back on recruitment, put recruitment freezes, reduced salary increases, reduced investment plans, because they just need to make sure they can be sustainable for the next year, 2 years. Cash flows and everything else are really, really tight. But families think in generations. They need that support and that longevity and that creative kind of growth policy to help them think for the longer term, which is good for the country.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. So, Sharon, you know, clearly there was a lot of noise last year around BPR and APR. That we saw that earlier this week there were a lot of farmers in Westminster with tractors as well. What are your thoughts following on from yesterday's announcements around this?
Yeah, well, picking up on Paul's point, that families and business owners generally actually need more certainty. Well, I think probably the last 12 months in my professional career has probably been the least amount of certainty that clients have actually had. And whilst I think it's good that conversations are being had in terms of succession and other things, it's really sort of through a pretty sad backdrop. So it does seem that the government have stuck with their core reforms on agricultural and business property relief, despite sort of a significant amount of lobbying from the farming sector. As Paul noted, we've got one minor concession, is they're now allowing the £1 million tax-free amount, first £1 million of APR, BPR, to be transferable to spouses or civil partners. So we're assuming that that's going to work in the same sort of way as the nil rate band and the residential nil rate band. So it means that a surviving spouse can potentially have £2 million worth of relief plus nil rate band and residential nil rate band, which is where they're getting to the £3 million of relief. So I think that's helpful. However, probably most people were planning around that anyway, so it's not really actually going to achieve much. As a headline, inheritance tax is forecast to increase from £9 billion this year to £14.5 billion in 2031. So inheritance tax has gone from being quite a small revenue raiser now to being a significant tax raiser, and is expected to increase. So, early planning in terms of mitigating that liability, looking at succession plan is going to be ever more critical. And there are opportunities, bearing in mind this regime doesn't come into play until April next year. There's a lot of work to be done, I think, in how you might sort of look at ownership structures, look at asset qualification and lifetime transfers, particularly using trust before April, that might give a better outcome.
Yeah.
Alex, what's your take on this from a company perspective and what that's going to mean for companies?
Well, I think it was good to hear Paul say just now that conversations are starting to happen. As we've already talked about, really, most of the headlines, of course, have been about the impact for farmers. But actually, these BPR changes go far wider than just farming businesses. And they do potentially impact on the succession planning for all family business and companies that have a value of more than £1 million. So I think the message I want to get across is that family businesses, and in particular companies, need to plan accordingly. Fortunately, there are still a range of measures which can be considered to mitigate the impact of these IHT changes, and we're having some good conversations around that. So for corporates, there's quite a number of different strategies that we can talk about, but one sort of relatively simple change just might be to sort of introduce a new share class, a sort of growth share class, so that future growth in value of the company falls into a share class that is held by the younger generations. That's a very valid mechanism for helping to mitigate against these changes. So yeah, I think my message there really is to take early advice, and as Sharon has already mentioned, action before. Well, I think you were going to mention that action before April 26 could be particularly beneficial for some, because there is a window of opportunity there. If I may, can I sort of stick with the subject of business succession, but move on from BPR and APR? I think it was also announced yesterday there's going to be changes to company disposals to the trustees of an employee ownership trust. EOTs, as they're more commonly called, offered a tax-free gain for disposing shareholders. So the use of EOTs over the recent years has unsurprisingly become quite popular. And actually it's been costing the government a lot more than they ever envisaged. So what we saw yesterday was that this relief is effective immediately, scaled back. And so actually, rather than a complete CGT exemption for the disposing shareholders, it's now only going to be a 50% CGT exemption. Obviously, some people will lament that change, but for me personally, actually, I quite welcome it, because I'm not convinced that EOTs are necessarily being used in the manner for which they were intended, i.e. for business succession, and in particular to benefit the employees of those businesses, of course. So I think that this change will help close, shall we say, the tax gap with other, still the tax-efficient methods for business succession, which may actually be more appropriate.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, Alex. EOTs, we've explored them with many of our clients, and sometimes they work, absolutely, but there are other options. I think where EOTs can struggle is how you flip it in the future. How's the secondary exit? And there are some complications around that. How you incentivise key individuals, particularly where people is your main asset, as many service type businesses are, and the legal documents can be very, very complex. So I share your view that it's perhaps not always the right option, but still available to our clients, and we continue to talk to clients about MBOs, private equity, part investment, trade sales or trade exits are still perfectly valid options. So all still on the table, I suppose.
Yeah, perhaps I could just pick up on MBOs, actually, since you've mentioned them, Darren. I mean, we do see management buyouts, work really well time and time again in succession planning for companies. And that's especially so really where the up-and-coming management team doesn't actually have the personal financial ability to buy what is often a valuable company. So basically, structured correctly, an MBO, under an MBO, a company effectively funds its own acquisition, typically over a number of years. But for the retiring shareholder, they're still able to dispose of their shares and realise a capital gain and pay those sort of attractive rates of capital gains tax, often with the benefit of business asset disposal relief. But for the incoming management, they don't have to fork out a huge amount of money or take on a load of borrowing, and really they're sort of funding that acquisition over the profits of the business over a few years. So lots of other tools really that are available in addition to EOTs.
Yeah, and you do wonder if MBOs have sort of sometimes been ignored because of the tax release on EOTs, so perhaps that will level it. EOTs will still be right for some businesses, but perhaps less from a tax-driven point of view and more for commercial reasons.
I think one thing that we haven't really looked at, but was within the budget yesterday, Sharon, was about the focus on tax enforcement. So it's almost as if they're not confident they've got the tax measures, so they just need to double down a little bit more on trying to get back what it is that people are supposed to be paying. What do you think was in the budget?
Well, I think increasingly over the years we've seen the lines blur between tax avoidance and tax evasion, and we see an increasing, I guess, an increasing aggressive stance taken by HMRC that we've been wrestling with. So as we typically see, there were a raft of measures that were introduced surrounding compliance and enforcement, which were really aimed at getting an additional £2.3 billion. And that, combined with previous reforms, they're aiming for more than £10 billion in additional revenues. So quite significant. It is an ongoing area of priority, and probably rightly so, that it is important to make sure that the right people are paying the right amount of tax, etc. What I felt was interesting is the extension to some of the powers, and the headlines are talking about HMRC getting more access to third-party data, introducing a reward scheme for informants, adding more debt management resource, targeting late filing, and particular focus in the construction industry on fraud and on image right structuring. So there's a whole range of measures actually in there. So we are seeing a lot of tactics that HMRC are deploying, generally using nudge letters, targeted inquiries on particular sectors, and tailored letters addressing certain taxpayer behaviours. So this is an extension to the enforcement strategy, but it does seem to be wanting to access more information in order to inform those targeted inquiries. So, I think there's a stretching of what's within their power.
Yeah, I agree, Sharon. I mean, I was just thinking of one example that we have seen in recent years of those sort of targeted inquiries where there's been a very heavy HMRC scrutiny of companies claiming R&D tax credits. And I mean, there's no doubt that increased HMRC scrutiny was needed because there was a lot of certainly error and fraud in the system. But I think, obviously the downside of all these sort of measures is that, where you've got legitimate claimants, is that actually they suffer as well because they have a lot of additional costs and indeed delays in securing, in the case of R&D tax credits, the repayments that they might be entitled to. So I think, HMRC have to get the balance right because it does hinder business, and there is a balance to be struck there.
Yeah.
Thank you both. So, I mean, looking forward then, what do we all think about the future of the UK economy and the interplay of the general direction of travel from this budget? So, the final poll of the seminar, how confident are you online about the UK economy following this budget? So, it'd be interesting to hear your views. And what I'd like to do now is to come back to our very kind participants online. So the two Pauls, Becky and Luke. Paul Britton, what are your thoughts about the UK economy following this budget?
Well, one of the things that was, I think, a missed opportunity was exporters, looking at how we can support SMEs in particular. I've heard that's been a common thread through the seminar here, doing more for SMEs, owner-managed businesses and family businesses. I mean, one in three of our members are actually exporters or importers, and there was nothing clear to see in terms of how we help those businesses to enter new markets or to upskill. That's got to be one of the most cost-effective ways to raise productivity, grow resilience. I think in that respect, there's all to play for. There's trading overseas is complicated, but I think with the right structures in place and the right attention for government, the reputation for the UK, despite what we've said today, is still strong. It's still a key investment destination, but we do need to see a longer term commitment from government, less flip-flopping around policies. And I think with that, we'll start to see the SME community spending more on their staff, investing more in long-term skills. So I agree with the sentiment today, and I'll be interested to see the result of this latest poll because it is very, very challenging. But I think for this region in particular, which has been one of the key net contributors to the UK, we have to present ourselves as one of the solutions to the whole of the UK and try to take appropriate risks to move forward. Has this budget helped to do that? As I said, devil's in the detail, probably not. But I still believe that the opportunities for this region and the wider business community is still there to play for.
Thanks very much, Paul. Paul Andrews, what are your thoughts?
I'd echo what Paul just said, Sue, to be honest. I think the general direction of travel from a family business community perspective needs to be longer term strategic policies that support investment for long term, and that's investment in the people that make businesses and make family businesses what they are today. Investment to help them support the businesses, the sustainable businesses for generations to come. And we have to understand the impact that family businesses have, not just in terms of jobs, the income they generate and the wealth they create. That gets reinvested back into our communities, and it supports the local sports clubs, the charities, and the actual community itself. So they're more intrinsic. They're invested in the place. They believe in what they're doing, but they want to do it for the long term for the community in which they operate. So I think we need policies that encourage them to meet the skills gap, recruit people to invest, and to invest and make those long-term strategic decisions, which are good for them, they're good for the community they operate in, but it's also good for the nation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Becky, what's your take on this?
I am confident about the future direction of the UK budget, but I think in many cases that's despite the actions of the Treasury yesterday rather than because of them. And I see my colleagues in 3M in the UK and also our customers and our suppliers all working incredibly hard to drive their businesses forward and to take up opportunities and to look for opportunities to export where they can. And they're all working incredibly hard. And I think, the future of the UK economy rests upon their shoulders. And I think that they are the key to success. The government has done some helpful things in this budget. It's done some unhelpful things in this budget, but ultimately, in many cases, it's down to the hard work and the grit and determination of my colleagues and others in the business sector.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a really interesting comment, because what we're beginning to see a lot more in the communities that we service in terms of our clients and so on is a lot more coming from the ground up in terms of people just seizing things and just getting on with things rather than waiting for something to roll out from government. And I wonder whether this budget is another point in which that sort of change, just sort of carries on as well. Luke, what are your impressions?
I agree with Becky. I think business will continue to grow. I don't think it's any thanks to the government. I think that would be down to the grit and determination of people who run these businesses. Businesses like mine, we want to grow, we want to invest, we want to hire more people, but it just seems in recent times we're constantly being hit from every direction, and the government says it supports growth, but then it makes it harder to invest and harder to employ more people, and I guess essentially harder to be competitive.
Thank you all very much for your contribution. I just want to reflect. We've had a few questions during this morning that have been coming through. Firstly, I'll just give you the results of that poll. How confident are you about the UK economy? Interestingly, 73% say that they're not confident about the economy. There's nobody saying they're very confident, and 27% are moderately confident. And I think that is, that's really quite startling. And I think that's something that it would be useful probably for the Chancellor and the Treasury to understand that that's the feeling. So in terms of some questions, one, Alex, we talked about growth and scale up and so on, and support for innovative companies. One of the most important things that you referenced was the success of R&D tax credits. Have there been one of the questions from the floor is, have there been any changes to R&D tax credits for SMEs?
I think the short answer is no, there weren't any changes to the main sort of headlines around R&D, and that's a good thing, because we've seen an awful lot of changes over recent years. Yep. So to have a bit of stability in the regime that we're dealing with, I think is a good thing. There was one announcement on R&D yesterday, but it was more around sort of administrative changes. So, but no changes to the headline rates.
Good. Okay. Another question. This was something that certainly had been looked at a lot. There was a lot of noise around this a month or so ago. Has anything altered with regard to the attractiveness of an LLP, limited liability partnership, as opposed to a limited company vehicle? Sharon, Darren, either of you?
There's an interesting question, and I think the noise that we heard before in terms of obviously making LLPs less advantageous, I think almost we're looking at this from a slightly different lens now, because if we've got an increase in dividends, where there's a top rate of tax of an extra 2%, where actually dividend income is going up to higher rates, I think there's some maths to be calculated in terms of actually, is a corporate environment as opposed to an LLP environment a better solution for people. It's going to be very much individual specific, But I don't think it's an easy, it's not an easy solution anymore to say, well, actually, when you get to a certain size, a corporate is better, and looking at that sort of cash extraction between salary and dividend, I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So certainly, I think we will have to give a lot more thought to that as a structure.
Particularly since the 2% not on additional rates, so it's going to be an interesting calculation and different in all circumstances.
At different levels, correct. Correct.
No, very interesting, very interesting. Thank you. Okay, so wrapping up now then, final thoughts from our JCK panel. Sharon.
Yeah, and just touching a little bit on some of the comments made in terms of business confidence. Certainly, with all the changes in the rural community, I think sort of confidence is significantly knocked. It's an incredibly difficult environment to make any money, and actually the long-term impact of the changes to APR and BPR for successive farmers is going to be significant. I think it's worth pausing a little bit on what didn't change, just as a recap, because we had so much noise out in the market for the last sort of 3 months, and despite the speculation, we haven't seen a rise in the headline rates of income tax, but we have obviously got the fiscal drag of those changes in rates. There were strong rumours about inheritance tax being reformed. Outside of the minor change to the APR BPR, we've seen no major adjustments to the inheritance tax regime. So current gifting regime still is available, and the same sort of regime in terms of trust is completely unaltered. I was expecting a nudge up of capital gains tax rates. We haven't seen a change of capital gains tax rates, so those have stayed the same. We've not really seen any changes to the CGT relief regime, and no change in terms of rebasing on death. So all of that is great stuff. Whilst we've got a slight change in terms of the ISA for cash ISAs for under 25s reducing to £12,000, for over 65s, over 65s still keep the £20,000 cash limit, and the 20,000 stocks and shares ISA stays the same. So a lot of things that could have changed and made life even more difficult haven't, which we can be thankful for. Overall, though, we will be paying a significant amount of tax in the coming years, and so I think there's very little for individuals to feel confident over, and very little that I can see that's going to stimulate economic investment.
Alex.
I think one of the themes that's come through for me today is that really it would have been nice to see some really good headline proposals that businesses could get behind, with the whether that's the startup, scale up, stay, or just generally for SME businesses. However, I think when I reflect on it, I've never seen a budget that has got so many measures that seem to be deferred into the future, and possibly even until after the next general election. So I think it's very clear that this was a spend now, pay later budget, and I guess who knows really whether the books will actually balance into the future. We watch this space.
Okay, thank you. Darren, your final thoughts.
I was going to pick up on confidence, but it's been mentioned time and time again, so I won't labour the point there. I suppose 2 things come to mind. We haven't talked at all about the workers' rights bill, not directly related to the budget, but I think business confidence is being impacted by the uncertainty there. So I think I would probably just focus on how can we get business confidence in the right direction. It feels at the moment the government are trying to tax their way to growth. We need to look at how we can really raise productivity and raise growth rates for all, really.
I think that's a really interesting comment, because I didn't come back on the poll about, does this budget make it easier for you to hire staff? But the results of that poll are really quite startling. In order to drive productivity, in order to grow the economy, and in order to actually have more tax to collect from people as individuals, we need more people back in the workforce. And our poll said 87% of people responding, it will not make it any easier. So this isn't helping with one of the primary objectives of the government in this. So that's really quite fascinating and very worrying as well. I think if that's how businesses are feeling on the morning after the budget. So there's been a lot of ground that we've covered this morning, and we know that there's going to be, as we've talked about on the panel and elsewhere, we know that there's going to be a lot more detail coming out over the next little while. We know, for example, there are a series of consultations that are set to take place, and a number of the measures, as Alex has just referenced, aren't due to come in for a little while. So they're scheduled for 27, 28 and 29. As a firm, of course, James Cooper Kreston will continue to keep you all updated with changes and with the detail as it evolves. So keep tuning into our website for updates. I'd really like to thank the James Cooper Kreston panel in the studio, Sharon, Darren and Alex, for their insight in guiding us through some of the measures in this Rachel Reeves' second budget. I'd also particularly like to thank Paul Andrews, Paul Britton, Becky Worth and Luke Consiglio for giving us all their insight into how they see the impact of the budget from the ground. This year, as you'll have noticed, we've pushed the boundaries further in terms of the technology. So massive, massive thanks to our own marketing team and to the team from D&B Solutions for managing this all for us. And thank you too to all of you for joining us. I know there were some questions posted by people in the audience that we weren't able to get to because of time, but we will answer those directly to you after today. And if you do have any further queries in relation to the presentation or in relation to any tax issues, please do contact us. We're always happy to try and help. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.